Welcome to part 7 in this series of videos where we look at Blazor WebAssembly from a beginner's perspective. I've called this video One-to-Many. In almost all applications other than the most simple, we have different pieces of data that are related to each other. In our case, we have countries and cities where we specify which country a particular city is located. The characteristic that defines a one-to-many relationship is that for a particular piece of data in one table, we can have multiple related pieces of data in the second table. Examples of this are in an accounting system, for example, customers and orders, where a customer may have many orders. In a social media application, it might be users and postings. And in an engineering application, it might be parts and components. Sometimes called parent-child relationship, it's no coincidence that databases such as SQL Server, Oracle and SQLite are called relational databases, or RDMS, Relational Database Management Systems. In our case, one country can have many cities, and this gives us a couple of things that we need to be very careful about. When we add a city, a child, we have to link it with the parent, in this case a country. Inevitably, this means that the country must exist before we can add the child. We must also be careful not to create orphan children. So when we, for example, delete a country, we've got to make sure that all the children are deleted either at the same time or before. But before we get into the nitty-gritty, let's just have a look at how I aim to have our main countries and cities page looking. So this is roughly what we'll be aiming for in this video. We've got the countries and cities with a drop-down box here, and then we'll list the cities underneath. So when we select a particular country, it will trigger a lookup and retrieve the cities for that particular country. So in this case, I've got some for Australia, and we then show the cities, and in this case as well the populations for them. And if we go back to one of the other countries, it'll then clear the grid. So that's what we're aiming at. So let's have a look at the code. As we have seen, the objective for the countries and cities page is to have a drop-down list of countries at the top of the page, and once the user has selected a country, to show cities for that country with their populations. The user will be able to add, edit and delete cities for the chosen country. As for the countries page, I will take this step by step. I want to use the home page to show countries and cities. To do this, we must replace the existing code in index.razor found in the shared folder in the client project. But before we tackle the changes needed to that page, I want to amend the menu to delete the options we don't need and to rename the index page or home page. In the shared folder, open up navmenu.razor, and the first change I want to make is the title at the top of the menu. I want to say Blazor Countries and Cities. So I'll insert Blazors there. I also don't want the counter page or the fetch data page, so I'll delete those two sections. And I want home to say countries and cities. So those should be all the changes we need there for the menu. Next, we need to tackle the index page. So if we open that, that's, as I say, that's under the client project, and under the pages folder, we've got index.razor. And I'm going to just get rid of what we've got there. And I'm going to replace it with this to start with. So the page directive is just the slash, which is effectively the home page or the index page. I'm injecting the country service. I'm giving it a page title of countries and cities list, and again a heading within the page of countries and cities. The first thing we need to do is to add a drop-down list at the top of the page. And I'm going to do that by replacing what we've got here with this code. So the HTML or CS HTML section at the top consists of just a Syncfusion drop-down list. It's got an item type of country, it's got a value of string, the data source is countries, which we've got defined down here, and the placeholder is going to tell the user select a country. Then on the drop-down list field settings, we've got text is country name, but we're actually going to be reading the country ID. At the moment, we've got in the countries record set, we've got two fields, country ID and country name. We'll be displaying the country name, but actually reading the country ID. The code we've got it declaring a list of type country, which we're calling countries, which is going to populate the data source up here. And on initialized async, we're getting the countries, and then we're putting them into a list called countries one by one. If we quickly run the system now, we'll find that we get the countries in ID sequence. So here's our page. If I select from the drop-down, we'll see that we've got them not in alphabetical sequence. We've got Australia, France, USA, Belgium, and Denmark. And we'd like those to be in alphabetical sequence. One way to achieve this would be to create a new controller service, an interface that got the data in country name sequence. An alternative that I'm going to adopt here, though, is to sort the list of countries by name after getting the data, but before populating the drop-down list. I'm going to replace the code with this. I've kept the data source for the drop-down list as countries, and I've renamed an intermediate list as countries unordered. So I've declared another list of type country called countries unordered, and it's countries unordered that the get countries populates. But then having added it, I'm then going to set that countries is going to be countries unordered dot order by and then country name, and I'm sending that to a list. We'll run it to check it. And now we see that it does, in fact, present the data in alphabetical sequence. But one thing I'm not keen on is the fact that the drop-down list and the list of countries occupies the full width of the page. So we'll tackle that. And a simple way to tackle that is to add a couple of properties to the drop-down list. So here we can declare the pop-up height property as being 200 pixels and the pop-up width as 250 pixels. And this is partially successful. We've got the drop-down list width and height, the kind of width that I'm looking for, but the actual box, the drop-down combo box, still occupies the full width of the page. If we want to control how this is displayed, we need to add some CSS, some cascading style sheet, and the following seems to solve the problem. I'm going to put a div around the whole drop-down list and give it a class name of drop-down wrapper. It could be anything. And then we're going to add some CSS. So let me put the div in. And we'll put the CSS code in here. and that simply says the width is 250 pixels. One more test. And we've got what we wanted. So the drop-down list only goes 250 pixels wide. Next, we need to add the grid in here. And to do that, under the drop-down list here, I'm going to insert this code. And this is for the grid. So it's a Syncfusion grid. We're giving an ID of city grid. The data source is going to be cities, yet to be defined. We're going to allow sorting and resizing, and the height is going to be 200. We've got two columns. This first column, the field is the city name, and I'm just calling it city name placeholder for the moment, and you'll see why later. The text header is going to say city name. It's going to be aligned to the left and the width of 50. This 50 is simply the percentage width or proportional width of the columns. The second column is going to be the city population. This time it's going to be text aligned right, and the format N is going to display numbers with comma separating the thousands. So if we add the data source here by just declaring another list, and again just running it, we've got our drop-down list but no records. The one thing I'm not keen on here is that the grid is very close up to the drop-down list. So we can improve that just by putting in a line break in here. So why don't we do that? And we can do that just by entering BR. And that'll put a line break in. The next stage is to link the countries drop-down with the grid, and later on to create a mechanism to allow the user to add cities. We will need methods to add, update and delete cities. This means we will need controllers, surfaces and interfaces. Much of what we need for cities is going to be virtually the same as for countries, and so I propose to copy the code for countries and then modify to cater for cities. We originally created a city controller, but haven't done much with it. We will simply overwrite the code with code copied from the country controller. So I'm going to go to the country controller to start with, and then select all the code in here. So I'll place the cursor at the top somewhere, Control A to select it all, Control C to copy it. Then I'll open the city controller, and then Control A to select it, and then I'm going to delete it by clicking the delete key, and then paste the code from the country controller, Control V. Now I'm going to go to the top of the file, and we're going to find and replace. So I'm just going to click at the top, Control F to find, and this opens this little box at the top right here, and I'm going to enter country because that's what we want to find, and then I'm going to click the little arrow to the left, and I want to replace it with city. The other thing I need to do is this little box here, which is to match case, which is Alt-C. I want that to be set to true. And that's true when it's got a little box around it, like that. Then I want to select this, which is whole words, which is Alt-W, and I can toggle it by clicking Alt-W. I want to not select whole words, so I want that to be false. Then I want to make sure that this says current documents It's got to be current document, otherwise there's a danger that you'll go through and change the code in all the other files. We can then run through and do the replacement. If one is confident that one's going to need to change everything, one can just select Replace All, which is Alt-A. Alternatively, we can select Replace Next, which is Alt-R. I'm confident that for this particular substitution, I'm happy to change everything or replace everything. So I'm just going to click this button here to replace all. So that's changed all the country for city. Then I want to change countries for cities. But this time I don't want to change that one there. So I'm just going to run through with this one, which is going to find and replace the next. And if I place the cursor down here, I should be able to do that without replacing it in the namespace. And there I stop. Now I also want to change so that lowercase countries is replaced with cities with a lowercase c as well. And I'm confident I can do this on all of them. So I'll replace all. Now I just need to run through these again, replacing lowercase country with lowercase city. And replace all again here. And that should have changed everything we need for the city controller. So I'm just going to save that. We now need to do the same for city service. So I've already got a folder called city service. So I can copy the country service, and in city service I'll add a new file, and I should say that I've upgraded to the latest version of Visual Studio, so it's not showing all the old templates as it used to, but I know this is city service. And we can replace everything in here with what we copied from country service. So I go to country service, Alt-A to select everything, Alt-C to copy, back here, Alt-A to select everything, Alt-V to replace. And I'm now going to run through changing the countries to city and so on, as I've done before, but I'll spare you the job of watching me do this. So I've now done that for the city service. So now we can follow a similar procedure for iCity service. So I'll copy the code from iCountry service. I'll create a new file under the city service folder. And replace that, and I'll just run through and do the find and replace, replacing country with city. So that's the iCity service changed. Again, just make sure that you don't change the countries in namespace. So now we need to register the service, and to do that we open Program CS in the client project and insert a couple of lines. So find program.cs. So we want this line under country service, which is a global using for the city service, and then we just need this line in the builder section. And I'm going to put it under the country service, so to keep these things together. So that should be okay. So that's set everything up. And now we just need to do the linking of the cities to the countries on index.razor. So let's find that. And we do that in a number of steps. So the first step is to add some drop-down list events to the Syncfusion drop-down list. And we do that by adding this code after the drop-down list field settings. And as you can see, it's called drop-down list events. The item type is country, the value is string, and when it changes, we're going to add a method there for the onChange. But we'll also need a new method in the city controller, and this is a hybrid of the existing methods of getCity and getCityById. So we're jumping around a bit here, but under city controller, and I think we'll have it under here. What we need to do is get cities by country ID, and we don't have this in here already. So it follows a similar pattern to the get city by city ID. We're calling it get cities by country ID. The parameters, we're only adding one, which is the country ID. The SQL is select asterisk from city, where country ID equals the country ID parameter being passed in, and then we're returning the cities. Note that the root here is cities by country ID. We now need to insert a corresponding service into city service. So under here we'll open up city service. So we'll have it under get cities by ID. And we'll name it get cities by country ID, and we're passing in the country ID, and we're declaring a variable called results, and we're getting from JSON async a list of cities from that route, passing in the country ID and then returning the cities. And we mustn't forget to change iCity service by inserting this line. Get cities by country ID, passing in an integer of country ID. And then finally, back in index, we need to make a couple of changes there. First of all, we need to add a parameter, because we'll be passing the selected country ID around. We also need to inject the city service, and we also need to create this method onChange. I'll add this down here. So when the drop-down item changes, it's going to trigger this method, and we're following pretty much what we did up here for countries, but I do need to add in a declaration for cities unordered. Now, if I run it now, we're going to see that it will work partially, but not completely. And we'll come back to this city placeholder. So if we run it now, we can select a country, but it will still show no records. Still no records, because we haven't got any records in the database. So I'm going to cheat at this point, and off screen I'm going to add a few records to the cities database using the DB browser for SQL. I've now made some changes, so let's see what it looks like. And what I'm getting here is the city name and population. I can see 3 rows which are blank. If I go to Belgium, on the other hand, I get no records displayed. And the reason for that is that I've just simply got placeholders here for the city name and population. I need to replace those with the actual field names. So if I change that to city name and city population, we should find that it works. Save the file, run it again. Select Australia, which is the one I've manually entered some data for, and I get some data returned, which is exactly what we were hoping for. At the moment, I had to use the database tool to actually enter the data. In the next video, I'll show how to add the ability to add, edit, and delete city records. Thank you very much for watching this video. I'll put some links in the description and in a slide at the end of this presentation with any useful links that I think could be helpful to you. Thank you very much.